Hi, this is Martin Fowler, and you're listening to the Agile Uprising.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Agile Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Troy Lightfoot, and with me, I have my co-host, Andrew Leff. Hello, Andrew.
Hey, Troy.
And today we're going to be talking about prioritization, whether that's backlog prioritization at a team level, program level, portfolio level, whatever level you're looking at. Tips and tricks. What have we seen that's working in clients that we've worked at? What have we improved on? What have we thrown out the window, said this is not really that effective? And we'll be talking about some of the most common techniques you've heard of and maybe some ones that aren't so common. All right. So, Andrew, you and I have both been working most recently, probably the last couple clients in SAFe. And SAFe has a backlog prioritization called Way to Shortest Job First. So we will be talking about that, probably pretty in-depth, and tips and tricks for that, and how to use that even if you're not using SAFe as a framework, how you could still utilize those types of techniques. But first, let's back up and say, what are your experiences with clients who don't really have a formalized process of prioritization, whether it's WSJF or something else, right? Have you experienced just, let's say, someone's highest paid person's opinion, right? Pushing through the prioritization, or what has kind of a lack of process been your experience?
Yeah, so for me, as we start talking about larger systems or larger systems of people, how do we deal with the shiny object syndrome, right? So how do we deal with everything being top priority? So we start down a path, and then someone comes in and they're an important individual in an organization and say, I need this right away. How do you negotiate? And I find that some of a tool like WSJF or something else that deals with economic prioritization, or an economic prioritization tool, can be very effective in the negotiation to deal with powerful stakeholders that are constantly injecting stress or disruption into the work that's in flight or the work that we have committed to do as teams. So it's always interesting to see that this person has a certain title, so we treat them differently, and we have to all rally around any request they bring forth. So I find these tools allow teams to negotiate and give them ability, or organizations, I should say, give them the ability to not say no, but push back and say not yet. Or we can negotiate. We need to deprioritize what we're working on to now refocus on what you're telling us you want.
What have you seen gone awry, let's say, with an approach without a process? Any experiences you have with that?
Yeah. So I mean, if you're let's just say you have an item list 1 through 10, it everything becomes a 1. So literally, right. How do you prioritize your work? Because you can't do everything. So how do you create that discussion around what is the most valuable thing we need to do? And it can't always be the biggest thing, right? We might be able to accomplish 5 things instead of just doing the one biggest thing that's going to take a lot longer. So I think, right. And something that you've talked about, I know we've had this conversation around, right, cost of delay. So I don't want to say that WSJF is a single silver bullet strategy, but I think it can be compelling to understand how the tool works and how it can assist you in dealing with challenging conversations and negotiations.
Right. So maybe let's get into cost of delay a little bit. So cost of delay at its core, I'm thinking of Reinertsen, his book, Principles of Product Development Flow. He's talking about, if I remember correctly, he's talking about quantitative cost of delay in that book. And what that means is you have a dollar amount per given amount of time that this feature or this whatever you're prioritizing isn't in production. Let's put it that way. So if you had a dollar amount pretty much estimated for every single feature, so if you say, hey, by April 30th, right, if this thing isn't in production, every week that it's not in production, it's costing us X amount of dollars. Right? Mm-hmm. Meaning that could be return on investment, that could be maybe a cost savings as well, right? You could be saving money if you put something in production. So if you had some quantitative data for everything you do, then it's quite easy to actually start calculating the quantitative cost of delay. But I think the problem is most places don't have that for everything. And there's all kinds of work that's not so easy to get that, especially for work which you're totally unsure about. Like you have a hypothesis of what the benefit's going to be, but you really don't know, right? So you have to come up with some leading indicators and kind of put it in production to see what's going to happen. And maybe in the future features coming from that, you'll have a better understanding about the quantitative analysis. So what SAFE has done is they have taken that concept of putting money on time, right, and value, and they have used something called Wage Assurance Job First, which is a qualitative cost of delay analysis. And what that means is you don't really have hard numbers per se for everything, but you are using essentially a proxy for value. So we could dive into that because that's probably one of the most popular ways now of doing prioritization for a lot of companies, considering the popularity of SAFE. And I have seen it, people use it that aren't even using SAFE, but they use that process. So that tells me that it seems to be pretty successful. So essentially you have a business value. The safe way is you basically use story points. So you have a business value, which you do some story pointing on. You have a risk reduction and opportunity enablement. And that means things like, obviously, if it's going to open up a new business opportunity, there's some value there, even though it might not have a ton of intrinsic business value on its own when it comes to return on investment necessarily. And the third is timing criticality. So how timing critical is it? For example, if you were building a laptop, for example, and you need to get the laptop out by August 1st because that's like the back to school window, and you don't get it out by August 1st, how much money are you losing? How timing critical is it? That's a simple example, right? Or another example I like to use is, I have these in my ears right now, the AirPods. And when Apple first launched, I think it was the iPhone 7 or one of them, I can't remember, the one without a headphone jack. Right.
I think it was the 8 or something.
Okay. One of those things. The first one without the headphone jack, they were working on the AirPods, but they didn't launch them at the same time. And you would think that they would want to, because it probably been a lot of revenue, right? Because they don't have a headphone jack. So you have to think about it this way. Every day that the AirPods weren't launched alongside that iPhone, they were losing probably X amount of dollars, whatever that perceived revenue would have been. So now the reasons why they didn't launch it alongside could have been, who knows what those reasons were. But I'm sure that they understood what the potential loss per day or per week or whatever was by not launching it at the same time, right? So they probably had to weigh out the quality problems they were maybe experiencing in production or something versus the amount of dollars they were losing, and said, well, it's not worth launching a product that could be buggy or whatever. Right? So anyway, so it's just about understanding the different economic decision making, right, in your prioritization. Sure. And then so that's the numerator. So you kind of add up the scores essentially for the story points of those things. And the denominator is a job duration, which is essentially how long may it take for this feature to be finished. And that is also usually done in a story pointing method. And that's the safe way. So, Andrew, after I've just explained that, it's a very basic explanation of it. Because some people who aren't used to it, probably like, what the hell is he talking about? Just maybe you could let me know your experiences with this. What have you seen gone well? Maybe a company or places that weren't doing it, that started doing it, that had some benefits. Maybe we could start there. Let's start with the positive. And then maybe we can get into some struggles you've seen as well.
Yeah, so I think I have struggled with getting the adoption around that economic prioritization of getting organizations to learn how to utilize that tool. So unfortunately or fortunately, that my success stories are kind of short. It's created a lot of active dialogue and a lot of open and honest conversation. I just don't know if I've been able to effectively utilize the tool in a meaningful way for the organizations I coach in. So I think it's more of I've used it and I've seen it being utilized, but in the way it resonates with me, it's not always in the ability to use this tool as a method and not a silver bullet strategy. So if I start with the bad, or continue on to some of the challenges I have, and maybe through this podcast, it'll be interesting to see if this solicits any feedback in a way that could be helpful to me to learn in regards to business value. I find that organizations, it's really hard for them to score business value as we go through that prioritization model. So utilizing WSJF, that business value, I find more organizations, and I'm talking companies that, we're on PI 17, PI 20, PI 22. They abandon doing business value because it almost becomes a competitive weapon amongst teams. So I'm working on things that have higher business value. So I'm devaluing my team by working on things that are low business value. So I've seen some weird dynamics around what that business value has created and moving away from truly what are we trying to do when we utilize WSJF. And it's not, that's Fibonacci. When we go towards scoring these things, utilizing Fibonacci, it's just, I almost look at it as just a swag. There's no right or wrong. It's just, what do we feel that the value of doing this is? Mm-hmm. So to me, that number, and maybe it's just a pattern from being human, that number feels like there's a sense of urgency behind it in a different way. So if something's a 10, if something's, or, a 3 or a 5, what does that mean? And I think every organization approaches that differently, but the reaction to that number is where I have struggled in getting organizations to move away from. There's almost a visceral reaction to the business value scoring.
Right. I actually agree with you. Man, when it comes to story pointing, even though it's not stories, but business value pointing, using any kind of Fibonacci numbers, people tend to get really either defensive or they get really hung up on the numbers, the difference between a 2 or a 3 or a 3 and a 5, right? Or a 5 and an 8. And, obviously agile teams who use that system for estimation, we tend to see that happen in a lot of teams that aren't so mature as well. So to me, it's an expectation almost that that's going to happen, especially if you've never done this kind of thing before. So I've kind of pivoted to another technique, which is still essentially using the cost of delay, qualitative cost of delay, and WSJF scoring, but getting to it from a totally different angle. And I can talk about that. So let me talk about that, and then I will talk about what I think is the most important part of this, as far as an input to the WSJF sessions or prioritization sessions. So one of the problems is if you have 3 categories, and so again, repeating, first category is business value, right? So that's simply put, what things are most valuable to business? Well, that's very subjective, obviously. Like I said, some things could have a hard value return on investment. Some things may not. The thing that may not might be more valuable to the business potentially. It's really hard to determine that with a dollar value on some things. The second category is reducing your risk and opening up new opportunities. And the third category is how time and critical it is. So you're expected to, the people that are prioritizing are expected to do story pointing on all 3 categories and then kind of add them all up and then divide by a job duration, and you get a score. And what that score is essentially kind of a guideline to sequencing. Now, you don't have to use it 100% sequencing, but it could be a good guide. So the idea is that the reason why we do it that way is to try to figure out what are the things with the highest value and what are the things with the highest value and least amount of time to develop, essentially, so we can get the highest return on investment over and over and over again. That's the concept. So one of the problems that Andrew is mentioning is people getting hung up on story points, people not really understanding it, people arguing about the difference between 2s and 3s, people not able to wrap their head around what is the difference between an 8 and a 13 when it comes to business value in a lot of arguments. So one of the techniques that I've used, it was taught to me by a gentleman named Kevin Callahan, who I worked with at a previous client. And we've actually had him on the podcast a couple of times. He's been on Advanced Product Ownership podcast we had. And then we had like 2 episodes pretty much about that. We had one about advanced product ownership and then one about flow, product ownership and flow. And he was on both of those. So he taught me this technique and he used it at that client and I watched him use it and I said, wow, like this is pretty effective. Like, so what he was able to do with that client was pretty effective. And he basically kind of at the time was dissing the way that the traditional safe WSJF process was working. And that to some coworkers kind of, that caused some disagreements, some arguments. And I was just kind of indifferent, to be honest with you. I just want to know what works the best. I don't really care what tool we use. Mm-hmm. So I was pretty open-minded to what he had to say. I tried it out. It works really freaking well. So I'm going to kind of tell you who's listening where to go to find out some more information on this, the basics. If you Google, and maybe what I'll do is I'll post a link right now for you so you can see what I'm looking at, Andrew. I'm going to post it in the Slack.
Yeah, and Troy, while you're doing that, if I can just ask a question, something that popped in my head as you're talking, I think that some of the disconnect or the gap is the way that those pieces of work or those features, capabilities are defined don't resonate in the way that the WSJF exercise walks you through, right? So it feels very disconnected when we're talking about the first thing that's popping into my head is like a system shall statement, right? So the system shall do this. How do you define? That's why business value, in my experience, has been a challenge for organizations because they're not looking at that product development piece in a different way. They're trying to overlay a WSJF process over what they're currently developing, and it just feels disconnected. So I just wanted to get that out there because I feel like that's part of the challenge as well, as if you're not looking at changing the way that you're creating your work, WSJF just becomes a layer of complication to or a layer of exposure for how you're working today.
Right. So I'll give you an example. I'm going to back up from the technique and then talk a little bit about what you said, then we'll get into the technique. So it's critical that you're thinking about products end to end, right? So end to end business value, iterative development, iterative and incremental development. And you won't get, actually, I was explaining this to someone the other day at work, and they came up with a pretty good metaphor, I think. I thought it was a pretty simple analogy. And that was, and I said, I'm going to steal that. And they gave me permission. They said it's the difference between shoveling a straight line from the sidewalk to your driveway, if your driveway is full of snow, right? Versus just shoveling each piece of the driveway until the whole driveway is clear, right? And like, that's the point where they kind of got what I was talking about. Like, that's the metaphor they use. Like, if we just shovel a straight line to the house, right? We can actually walk to the house. Now, the rest of the driveway is going to be still full of snow, okay? But at least we have a path to get to the house and we can get some value out of it, as opposed to the way they were thinking about doing things, which was shoveling the whole damn thing piece by piece until you can get to the door, right? So if you think about that when it comes to features and epics or whatever you're using, think about that. How do we consistently write features in a way to get some end-to-end value over and over again. So I think maybe that, Andrew, that's what maybe we were talking about.
Yeah, no, it was, and I wasn't sure where you were going with the shoveling comment, but you got me there. It became very vivid. So I the patient quality as far as listening resonated. So thank you for getting me there.
Okay, you're welcome. Yeah, when he first said it, I was like, you know what? That's a pretty good metaphor, actually, because it's simple, but it explains it. So, some tips to think about. If your company, it really starts at the very top of the vision, honestly, like at the very, very, very top. Okay. There's a story that a friend of mine, Dave Pryor, likes to tell. And he tells it at his public classes. So I'm assuming it's safe to say on that podcast. He was at a client. Actually, I won't even say the name of the client just to be safe, but he was at a client when he used to be consulting. And that client was a streaming music service who I don't even know if they exist anymore. And he went around to the development teams and asked them like, oh, okay, what's your vision? And they all had a different answer about what the company vision was. Like every single team had a different answer. And then he actually went to, I believe it was the CEO he got to speak with the CEO. And he said, what's your vision? So all the teams were mentioning about music and being the best music player and these types of things, right? And the CEO said, oh, my vision is to sell subscriptions, whatever it takes. I don't care if it's music. I don't care if it's whatever, right?
Right.
I don't care if we're selling T-shirts. We're selling subscriptions, right? And the disconnect between what the people on the ground who were doing the work were coming up with some of these ideas thought and what the CEO thought was totally different. And the fact that that company didn't have a strong vision for being a great music player or a great music streaming service, but it was more about how do we just sell stuff, maybe is why, I don't know if they exist or not now, but I can tell you they're not very popular if they do exist. And they used to be pretty popular. So I'm just speculating now. I have no idea. But that goes to the fact that the vision is starting at the top. If you don't have a strong vision at the top, at least you can have people in product who are coming up with product visions and strategic themes, right? So maybe we can talk about how a strategic theme and or product vision feeds into some of these WSJF conversations in a good way, right? So to drive the right conversations. So how do we determine business value? Well, if what we're talking about is going to help us achieve one of our strategic themes, right, or achieve the vision, then maybe it does have value over things that might not, or what's the impact of how much is it going to move the needle on this theme, right? So let's say a theme is something about growing a market share in a certain demographic, right? So if you want to grow 10% market share this year in ages, male 18 to 34 or whatever, right? So I'm just making up things. But if you have some theme about that, then the features you're WSJFing or you're prioritizing, if that's one of your main themes, and that is a feature that's going to contribute to that, then it would naturally lend itself to have a higher business value than features that do not, right? That may be a secondary theme if that's like your main theme, right? So you can use strategic themes at a product level to drive the right conversations. You can also use product visions. So obviously you should have a company vision, but if the company vision is weak, then you can use product vision to drive this. Do you have any thoughts before I get into this technique I'm about to talk about? Do you have any thoughts about vision, themes, and fueling prioritization conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a whole huge discussion. I spent a lot of time in that space because I feel like it's important to learn how to develop product. And of course, it depends on what type of organization you're in. So if we're talking about technology, let's just say we're building some form of technology and we have an offering. I like to phrase things in a way, and I'm not going to go too deep into this because I feel like this could be a whole discussion on its own. But, we refer to things, in an MVP sort of way, minimal viable product. I never liked that because minimal feels like I'm not getting enough. Right. So what if we look, and a while ago I read something around like MLP.
Mm-hmm.
So have you heard that term?
Minimal lovable product?
Yep.
Minimum lovable product, yes.
So how do we make our customers fall in love with us over and over and over again and continue to want to be in a relationship with us as a company? Maybe I'm being too weird or too abstract, but I strongly subscribe to that type of coaching as far as that's what we want to do to get their engagement, their partnership, and their return, right? So we want them to fall in love with us. We want to enchant them, and we want to offer that value to them over and over and over again. That's really hard to do. How do you create an emotional reaction to a piece of software or a piece of tech? So it's to me, it creates that visioning, and that product development creates not only the internal love for the product, but the external love for the product, what we offer. So it to me, it's just getting an organization to look at it that way, because we have to make money, we have to live, we have to support whatever. It can be abstract or hard, like too foofy, too fluffy, not. There's the ROI is I need a rate of return of X. I need X% to make sure I'm doing something right. So it just becomes numbers on a spreadsheet.
Yeah. So minimum lovable product. I love that. That's a great concept. There's also another technique which you talked about before, minimum lovable product, and I think both of them have uses in different contexts. So minimal viable product comes from the lean startup, and I think there's a lot of confusion around that. People think viable means the minimum amount of features that somebody would use. And that's actually not the intention of that. It's more about the minimum thing that we can do to prove something is viable or not, right? It's more about testing a hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
So that could be something as simple as, there's a technique called a fake door. So let's say that you have an idea for a feature, and that feature might take 4 sprints to develop. Right. So every sprint has usually has a fixed cost for the sprint for the team. So let's say that cost, I'm just going to throw a random number out there, is $40,000 per sprint. So you're talking about that feature, if that's the only feature that team's going to work on, would cost roughly $160,000. Okay. So an MVP for that kind of feature would be something that you could build to go test if people want that thing or not without spending $160,000 and 4 sprints worth of work. It actually doesn't have to be usable. I think that's the difference between that minimum lovable thing and minimum viable, right? So like
it's a great point. So I just want to agree with you. So I think that's a good point to make.
So like you could create a fake door. So let's say you had an idea for a feature, and you really thought that this is a new feature that people are going to love, right? So what could you do to go test that hypothesis before you spent $160,000 in 4 sprints? Well, maybe you could target a set of, I'm just throwing literally random ideas out there, but trying to give you an example. So maybe you could target a certain subset of users, let's say on Facebook, right? Who you think are potential users, right? A demographic, an area of the country, of the world, whatever. Run some targeted ad campaigns, right? Maybe spend $10,000 on some ad campaigns. Put up essentially a landing page for the feature, and with a little button that, like, basically a little Photoshop design that says what the feature is, and like click here to sign up or whatever the thing is. And you could have a hypothesis that you're going to get so many click-throughs and so many signups that if you get X amount of signups per dollar spent, that people might be interested in this feature, right? That's kind of one way of doing an MVP. There are many ways of doing it. Obviously, you could build a subset of that feature and test that out, but a subset may not give you what you want. An image with a description and then just a general interest may actually give you more. It is very context dependent on what you're looking for. So, yes, go ahead.
Yeah. So if I can just give an example as well, and it's funny, what you asked me in the beginning of this, it didn't come to me until just now. Mm-hmm. So something along that line of that rapid prototyping mentality. We want to rapidly prototype and not spend a lot of time on pixel perfect. Right. So if and I have a lot of, experience in the mobile application development space. So something along those lines of everything became a priority and WSJF wasn't becoming effective because people weren't honoring it and utilizing it in some of the way we want to intend to use it. So an experiment that I ran was utilizing our stakeholders and leadership within the organization to be our focus group. And releasing through technology like Test Flight, here's the app, go play with it and tell us. And we're going to constantly be releasing to that Test Flight instance. And you become that A/B type testing user group, but it's the leaders within the organization. So then it becomes how they feed that feedback to us. And then the teams can prioritize based upon that feedback, and they become part of the prioritization model. So it was a compelling experiment around the people that were the biggest disruptors of the prioritization, because everything was a sense of urgency, became part of the process around being innovative and being a contributor, not just a top-down, but actually being a feedback loop in the way that we would engage customers.
So that's a great point. In fact, there's an app that I use all the time called Zero. It's an intermittent fasting app, and they were working on a new release, and they actually looked at a subset of their users who were more heavy users. I think I don't know how they came up with the criteria, but so I got an email and said, "Would you be interested in being a beta tester for our new release?" And I'm telling you, every 2 days, they were releasing new features, new updates. And I would say they did this for like a month or 6 weeks or something, that at least I was part of it. And they would get feedback. So every time they'd put out a next version, they would be like beta 1.1, 1.2, 1.3. They would ask you for your feedback. They would send you little surveys. They would, you could comment or whatever about features you still wish were there, features that aren't working right for you, things like that. And I really believe that as they were using that to actually iterate on their final release. So that was kind of cool to be part of that. So that's just a side note, something that this app was doing, which I thought was pretty cool. So going back to WSJF for a second, it can work. One of the anti-patterns I've seen of it is people, they get focused on the points way too much and the difference between a 5 and an 8, and they just argue over things and they go down rabbit holes. 2 is they end up assigning one person to just say, okay, you do the business value, because that's just easy to get the numbers. So they're so focused on the numbers. Sometimes people miss the point. The point is the numbers are the least important thing about this process. The most important thing is that people are communicating and having to justify their positions about why they think the business value or opportunity enablement or time and criticality is high or low. And then there's an alignment between people at the company around these things. That's the number one thing. The number itself is the least important, because even at the end, when you go through the calculations, they're just a guideline. You're not supposed to follow them blindly at the end anyway. Right?
Yeah. And just something to touch on real quick. I always find it compelling, like the numbers, right? We always get tied around the numbers. And that's why I'm like, it's a swag. And then I say, do you know what a swag means? And people kind of tilt their head. They give that, curious dog tilt. And I'm like, the acronym for swag is some wild ass guess. Does that help you understand that these are just guesses, right? They're just a guess, and there's no more to that. And as you get better, I should say, as you practice more, you'll start to figure out how to understand trends and baselines and how things feel based upon size, complexity, and how you want to utilize those numbers to support the work. So,
Yep. So I have a technique which, if you're listening and if you happen to be at a computer or sitting on your phone or something, you can Google black swan farming qualitative cost of delay. That's a long Google, I know, but you can Google that, okay? And you will most likely come up with the page I'm looking at. It's actually blackswanfarming.com/qualitative-cost of -delay or something like that, -delay. So And what you will see on that page is a little explanation about qualitative cost of delay. And so there is a 9-box matrix, and on the y-axis is value, and on the x-axis is urgency. So if you think about WSJF is looking at business value and risk reduction, opportunity enablement as both value type of part of the Fibonacci sequence, right? And that they're additive essentially, and then they add time and criticality on top of that. This is quite a bit of a different approach. This is saying we're not using any numbers. We're just using on this website they use this bonus and killer. I just like to use low, medium, and high, and I just look at it as low are things that okay, this is going to keep the lights on, or this isn't really required, but maybe it would be nice kind of thing. To medium is okay, we will see some definite business value out of this, although it's not as high priority as the high. And then obviously high is high and very high are things that are going to bring you a huge return on investment or open up huge opportunities or huge cost savings, things like that, right? So it's pretty simple. And if you go on the website, they explain the different categories, the way they put them a little differently, but that's okay. You can use it however you want. But and then on the y-axis we have whenever, soon, and ASAP, and they are ambiguous on purpose. So I'll give you a context which I have seen work at a previous client and even at this current client, and that is since Kevin taught this thing to me, is that for your value it's going to be different for different cases, and for your urgency it's also going to be different. So I've seen some people say, hey, for us ASAP is this quarter. Right. So it's it has to be out this quarter. If it has to be out this quarter, it goes into that side of the x-axis, right? If it can go out in the next quarter, but no longer, then it's in soon. And then whenever is literally, it could be delivered whenever, right? It doesn't really matter. There's no time and criticality for it. But your context may be totally different. ASAP maybe it's got to be out in the next month, next sprint or whatever, right? Whatever it is. Okay. So that's going to be up to you to determine who is ever doing the prioritization and the facilitator here. So what I like to do is, here's my technique, and I'm convinced that this typically, or at least in my experience, does work better than traditional WSJF. So what you do is you get the people involved in the prioritization, and you write out all of assuming you're doing this in a physical room. If not, you can use something like real-time board. That's also okay. And let's assume we're all in the same room for this. For now, we'll have sticky notes that represent the features or stories or epics or whatever we're trying to prioritize. Okay. And so let's say we're going to prioritize 10 in this one session. So we'll have 10 on the wall, just in a block, no particular order. They're just sitting there. Okay.
Right.
Somebody will, in product, maybe the product manager or someone will go through and explain what these things are. If there wasn't a good practice, is actually something that I coach and I've seen work really well, is no matter what the level is, portfolio, program, team, to do a story map of whatever you're doing. Okay, so features, stories, epics, just do a story map of those things, lay it out, and then send that out to people ahead of time that are coming to this, and they can get a context of where this falls into end-to-end value, what type of users are involved. So it gives them a little bit of prep work, So let's say you've done that. You kick it off. You do some context. Here's your strategic themes for this year. Here's our product visions. Here's the features that we think are going to tie back to some of these things. We're going to be prioritizing them today. And then, okay, let's go. So the thing I like to do as a coach or a facilitator, I should say, in this example, is to do something called affinity mapping. And what that means is let's say you have 6 people who are going to be involved in this prioritization. You have all 6 people stand at this board or the wall where these features are in a group. And for, let's say, 3 minutes, they are going to silently map them, what they think the priority is, from left to right, just straight in a linear line. Okay. And so and they're allowed to move them around, but they just can't talk. So What that means is, so let's say that Andrew, you and I are going to prioritize, right? And we're both up there, and then I move something far to the left, and you move something far to the right, and we're looking at it. And then all of a sudden, the thing that you moved all the way to the left, I totally disagree with that, right? But I can't talk to you about it because I only have 2 or 3 minutes. So I'm just going to move it over to the middle, and that's totally fine to do, actually. And what that does is it starts to immediately show where the disconnects are. Like where the disagreements are, where the lack of alignment is, like right away before we even have any conversations about story points or going down rabbit holes or anything like that, right? So then what I do is, as a facilitator, I will usually talk about, okay, here are the stories which were moved over the most, which were most disagreed upon. So we're just going to kind of keep them here. Here are the stories. We're going to start at the very left, which are lowest value stories. So I'll just pick the first one up and I say, this is all the way to the left by all of you people. Do you all agree that this is the lowest value story? So far, every time I've done that, everyone has said yes. Okay. So then it's like, oh, we've already identified the lowest value. So if you look at this 9-box matrix, we say, okay, we know it's a low value. So now we're going to discuss as a group the timing criticality. It's either going to be ASAP, soon, or whatever, and context dependent, of course. So then the people will have a discussion. And then they'll say, hey, this really can be delivered whenever. So immediately you just throw it in that bottom left box, which is that low value whenever, right? And then it's done. You don't worry about story points at this point. Then you take the next story to the right. You do the same thing. You just say value. Is it more or less than this one? Or is it roughly the same? If it's roughly the same, now we know where the y-axis is. We talk about the urgency. If it's soon, then we put it over to the right. You go through that. I'm telling you, you can have 10. One, it's a pretty quick way to do it. And two, I've seen it drive the most conversations compared to the traditional way of thinking about points. Because now you have to justify why you have it physically represented, and you have to say it's either above this thing or to the right of this thing or down, and here's why. And then you immediately see the disconnects and the disagreements. And that's instead of focusing on points or focusing on one person's opinion. And so as a facilitator, it's really important to listen for differences of opinion and then ask for input. Because what will happen is people will tend to either get quiet sometimes if they don't want to, sometimes people just don't like conflict, right? Mm-hmm. And even if it's constructive conflict, they just don't like it. And that's fine. Or sometimes somebody will be more senior than them in there and they might not feel comfortable speaking up. So as a facilitator, it's important to have everyone's voices heard as equal as possible that are involved in this. So you want to do that, and you want to kind of ask questions, open-ended questions sometimes, to drive the conversation forward. And then everyone has to agree to where this thing goes. And at the very, if we can't agree, then we at least come to a consensus, right?
Sure.
So, and then we do that. So after the 10 are done, you're going to have 10 in this example. Stories, features, epics, whatever you're prioritizing, in this visual grid. And then it's really, really easy just to write story points on the boxes. So I've sent you an example of how I've done that in the past. And what I tend to do is I tend to think like bottom left, right, is like 1 and 2. And then mid left is like 3 and 5. And then everything else just gets one number. Because the higher you go in a Fibonacci, the less and less accurate it becomes. Right?
Yep.
So then it's like, okay, 8 up top left at the bottom is also an 8. So it's like 8, 13, 20, 20, 40, 100, right? It's just boom. And then I just go, is this make sense to everybody? And usually people go, yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Then the story points are done. The story points are done at the very end, basically. And it's like, that is the numerator. So we don't have to worry about, so we have time and criticality and we have business value done in one shot, essentially. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I have a question for you about that. But yes. One thing before I get to the question is I use old school. I don't know if they're old school, but going back to 100 years ago when I was writing, business requirements is the Moscow model, right? So using that point of entry to the must have, should have, could have, won't have at this time, it can help frame up going into that prioritization as far as, what do we want to do? What do we need to do? What would we like to do, but we're not going to do? So knowing that there's multiple techniques to accomplish the same thing, in your experience with your experimentation, how long has it taken? And it's going to vary, but if you had to baseline it to get that experimentation around the methods that you're trying, how has it been difficult? Has it taken a lot longer to get them to even think of it as a learning immersive experience, and you're co-creating what WSJF means within that organization as you facilitate? You come from a facilitation standpoint, but also at some point you have to take that facilitation, step over into the other side of the room and coach. So sometimes you have to play multiple roles within the same discussion.
Sure.
What has been your experience as far as, has it taken a long time to get the ability to experiment around these concepts that you're trying to do?
Honestly, no, around this particular one. And that's why I said this going forward, this is probably the technique I'm going to be my go-to, because over the traditional wish shift technique, because traditional wish shift, I've just seen so many anti-patterns with it. And not that it can't be successful, it can be. It's just that this simplifies things and still gets to the same outcome. And I think sometimes better, which is alignment. So if the outcome of wish shift, if what we're trying to get is alignment between people with differing opinions and different stakeholders, different things they're responsible for, then I found this to be very effective, and people don't worry about points. That's like, they're not even thinking about it. So that I personally love about it. I will say this though, like any process, sometimes people will go to a training, for example, and they'll learn a process or they'll see someone else do it, but you don't necessarily understand the full why behind the process. Like you understand, okay, we're supposed to get some numbers here so we can prioritize. The true why though is alignment and about shared understanding. That's the true why. So if you understand that, then it changes how you facilitate those sessions, whether you're doing traditional wish shift or what I'm talking about. So a second point to that, Andrew, is I think the key to these types of events, meetings, whatever we want to call them, is facilitation. So having someone who is trained and skilled with facilitation is really critical to getting to agreed upon outcomes in the meeting. Otherwise, people tend to go down rabbit holes. We don't get to the outcomes we want. People start saying, this sucks, wish shift sucks. They don't want to come to the meetings. You get lower attendance. So actually investing in people in your organization in actual facilitation skills is really necessary, because why is it that like you or I or any coach that has facilitation skills and experiences, we come in there and we do these things and they tend to work, but yet companies we go to, they may not see the value in facilitation, or it's kind of like sometimes I don't think they see that consultants that have facilitation skills are bringing that skills in, as opposed to they just think it's our experiences, like necessarily the experiences at these processes. Experience is part of it, but it's any meeting, if it's facilitated well, you don't even have to know the context of the meeting. Like you have to understand the purpose, of course, but you don't have to understand the details. So if I'm facilitating a wish shift session, I really don't have to understand the technical details of what they're talking about or the products. I just have to understand the purpose of the meeting and how to help lead them there, right? And how to ask the right questions and how to drive the right conversations and get everyone's input. So that's two different focuses. And I think one anti-pattern could be people facilitating that are also involved in decision-making. That's an anti-pattern because you're not a neutral party at that point. So having someone outside of the decision makers facilitating I think is pretty important. So that's kind of an anti-pattern I would look out for. And then one is treating it like a process, but not looking at the why. And it is a process, obviously, but like any process, it can be iterated on and improved. And maybe you start off with traditional wish shift and maybe you get really good at that and that works for you. And that's awesome. Like you don't need to change it. Okay. But if you feel like it's not working for some reason, like I've seen, maybe you try another technique like what I'm talking about here, or you try Moscow, or you try some other technique. I'll give you another example, Andrew, of something I've used quite a few times. And that's called a Kano analysis. Yeah. And sometimes we've used the Kano analysis to be inputs to these conversations. So they're not the end all be all prioritization, but what they are basically, well, here's what the Kano analysis said. So from the end users, potential end users, so maybe this thing has a higher value than we initially thought, right? So that could drive some of those business value decision makings if you do some kind of surveys and analysis beforehand. So there's a lot of techniques to use. I mean, they're all tools in a toolbox. The most important thing is individuals and interactions, right? So the people in the meeting and the way they're communicating and collaborating, and that we're getting to alignment. So that's what I would say about the process. Any kind of last thoughts about WSJF or prioritization you have?
No, and I think we've touched on so many things, and it's one of the challenges that I find with these, as we podcast and we build this content and information, is there's so many things that I want to touch in on that, facilitation, you and I have had some really in-depth conversations around what that means. And it's not necessarily a skill an organization may focus in on in a delivery environment, but it's a critical skill. And I think a lot of what we talk about, the themes and patterns, what we observe in organizations, facilitation can be a real way and method to help organizations understand that there's so many tools, right? So if you just want to keep swinging a hammer, that's not always going to be the most effective method. So how do you start to reveal the system to itself, but also facilitate that immersive experience when we talk about revealing the system to itself, and literally the system is a group of people or an organization? How do they start to understand the patterns that they're observing and utilizing these tools to help either release pressure or expose things to prioritize them to be able to address?
Right.
I think when we go down this path as far as WSJF, it just doesn't have to be units of delivery work. I am experimenting around it now in an organization that I am not in a technical space at all. This is all cultural. This is at a leadership level. This is truly doing, how do we inspire culture change, knowing that strategy, eats culture for breakfast. I'm sorry, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So
right.
It's late. I'm getting a little tired, but so I think that all of that's important.
Maybe we need to have a podcast around the case for facilitation. That could be a good one.
Yeah, and I think you and I have kind of started that banter back and forth, and again, it's just life gets in the way. But I would also be very curious, and I hope people find value in this discussion, because I enjoy these types of discussions. So I would be curious how this resonates with our listeners, and I would really welcome any feedback, right? Good or bad, it's all feedback. I'd be curious to see how others are dealing with the economic prioritization within an organization around work or around people or around something, and what tools and methods that they've seen either be a crash and burn or have been helpful delivering the message. And again, I think that, so I thank you for letting me participate in this discussion. I know this was sort of a from the hip discussion, and I've enjoyed it.
So I wanted to thank you, Andrew, for your time, your participation in this. I had a good time talking about this stuff. I like kind of going outside of the box with techniques, inventing new techniques, or learning about techniques from other people that are going to work out better for some clients or some cases. Like I said, WSJF may work for a lot of people out of the box, and that's totally fine. But I kind of enjoy thinking outside of the box a bit. Maybe that's why I'm into this Agile thing in the first place. And it's funny that I kind of view Agile as thinking outside the box, yet a lot of the trainings and the processes are in the box, So any opportunity I get to come up with new ways or learn new ways of doing things slightly outside the box, I dig that. So I appreciate the time for you listening out there. And again, thank you for your time. And so you can join us at the Coalition at coalition.agileuprising.com. Andrew, where can people find you? Are you on LinkedIn or Twitter or?
Yeah. So I'm on LinkedIn, Andrew Leff, and on Twitter at LeanLeff is my Twitter handle. So, and always at Agile Uprising as well. You can find all of us. So again, this is I think something that you inspire in me, Troy, and it's been awesome to observe you and your personal agile journey as you go into the coaching path as you have been, has really just been touching hearts to open minds, right? So
right.
I will end with this, and if I have to phrase it in a kitschy way, my mentor, who is a very influential coach in my life, has not only mentored me, but I've watched him mentor organizations. He phrased this to me, and it just resonates. We want to be tour guides, not travel agents. So watching people not be so prescriptive as far as you need to visit each country, here's your itinerary. We want to be tour guides. We want to help them understand where they want to go, or listen to them and guide them along the way with the knowledge and experience that we have.
Beautiful. Love it. All right. Well, thank you very much. And we'll see you next time.